but we can absolutely begin.
Okay. Thank you all for joining us on this Wednesday night at 5:30. We're really grateful for your participation, but I'm mostly grateful for Tammy and Dr. Hoda for joining us. We spoke, it feels like 50 years ago, to be honest with you. It was in the summer before we actually applied for funding from Lululemon, which is funding this training. So we received that grant. I'm really excited to have the opportunity to talk and have some hard discussions and just get a little bit uncomfortable, but to really open our eyes to potential microaggressions or implicit biases that we may have that we were unaware of. And I'm really excited for that. So to jump in, I'm going to give you just a very brief bio of Dr. Hoda. You can find more information on her website, but something I'd like to point out is I learned a lot about her and a lot about culture and stuff that I didn't even know just by reading her bio. So I really recommend you go to All Things Diverse and to read that. So Tammy Hodo was born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which continues to be among the top 3 most segregated metropolitan areas for Blacks in America. Her parents, an interracial couple, married in 1962, before the landmark 1967 U.S. Supreme Court case, Loving versus Virginia. In that case, outlawed state laws banning interracial marriage. When her white mother married her Black father, she was disowned by most of her family, as an interracial marriages was not something that was acceptable to many at that time. Tammy is the youngest of her parents' 3 children and grew up in a predominantly white community on the east side of Milwaukee. Being biracial and primarily reared by her white mother afforded her opportunities that she later learned are denied to many people of color. After completing high school, she enlisted in the United States Navy and served a 4-year enlistment. Upon completing her military obligation, she opted to attend the Albany State University, a historical Black college. She obtained her Bachelor of Science degree at ASU in criminal justice and immediately went on to obtain her Master of Public Administration with a concentration in government for Columbus State University, which is a predominantly white institution of higher education. Upon completing her master's degree, she worked for the federal and state government for several years while traveling the world with her husband while he served in the military. While living abroad for over 5 years, she found that she was identified as American by Europeans first, and then Black secondarily, if at all. Upon returning to the U.S. after living abroad, she enrolled and completed her doctorate of philosophy degree at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, where she majored in urban studies and minored in sociology. Her dissertation focused on the experience of minority faculty at predominantly white institutions of higher education. Tammy is a TEDx Jacksonville speaker. Tammy has written course content entitled Implicit Biases, Microaggressions, Awareness on Campus for a higher education vendor that is being used at hundreds of colleges and universities. She has been on NPR radio with First Coast Connect with Melissa Ross, discussing workplace diversity and inclusion. She has served as a moderator for a panel discussion on implicit bias, criminal justice, hosted by Edward Waters College, which included the sheriff of Jacksonville, the state attorney, public defender, chief judge, and senior district judge for Duval County. She has served as a featured speaker for the Association of Title IX Administrators, where her speech was entitled Title IX and the Me Too Movement, the continued need to address sexual assault, harassment, and sexual violence in our society. She has served as the closing keynote speaker at the 2018 Annual National Behavioral Intervention Team Association Conference. Tammy established All Things Diverse because of personal experiences and the desire to educate others. All Things Diverse strives to be one of the organizations that serves as a change agent in our society, reminding us of our capabilities when we work together for the betterment of our world versus being divided by irrelevant ideas of stratification based on race, class, sex, sexual orientation, identity, and religion. It is my absolute pleasure to be able to learn from you, Dr. Hoda, and I give you the floor. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That was an amazing introduction. I feel, I want to learn from me too. I'm pretty impressed. Thank you. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'm excited to be here. I think that this is phenomenal. What you all do. I know that, the demographic that you work with, and a lot of trauma has been imposed upon a variety of communities. You address people who have been incarcerated. And I think it's really relevant that you're culturally diverse and understand some of the struggles and the internal conflicts that people have. So I'm just really happy to be here. So we'll go ahead and dive in. So the agenda for tonight, we're going to talk about what diversity is, the areas of it, the emotional toll that racism takes upon people, disparities. We're going to look at a diversity profile activity. We'll talk about some of the terminology, so we make sure that when we speak about diversity, equity, and inclusion, that we're all using the same terms correctly. We're going to speak about allyship, which is so important, and diversity in the not-for-profit arena, as well as white privilege. And I know when we get to white privilege, some people are uncomfortable with that conversation. But again, as a biracial person, I can tell you that this is very much something that is real. I was able to grow up basically cloaked in it. And so I'll just share with you, a variety of things to make you just consider that. If everyone could just go on mute, I'd really appreciate that. So what is diversity? Diversity is more than just black and white, right? First of all, race, I want you to understand, is a social construct. Race is not even real. It is something that has been created.
Dr. Hodo, you went on. There you go.
Okay, there I go. Sorry, I'm sorry. I don't know what happened there. But diversity, as I was saying, is more than just black and white. It's a variety of variables, but oftentimes when we talk about diversity, that's where people go. Race is not real. It's a social construct. So reality is we're all ethnic, but diversity is recognizing that people are different with a variety of perspectives and life experiences. And some of those variables that attribute to our differences are our culture, our sexual orientation, our abilities, gender, race, ethnicity, religion, things of this nature. So those are just some, but that doesn't exhaust everything. We also have to think about educational level, things like that. Now, equity, what I often hear is used interchangeably with equality, and these are two totally different things. So equity is recognizing the qualities of justness, fairness, and impartiality. And we must treat people according to their circumstances, which often have to do with historical as well as contemporary policies and practices. So this is one of my favorite slides because to me, this is a great example of the difference between equality versus equity. So in the first picture, you see that, it assumes that everyone is starting at the same place, which is not true in America. And I mean, if we know our history, we know this to be true. You think about it, we just celebrated the centennial of women gaining the right to vote with the 19th Amendment. So we know we're not starting at the same place, and this picture depicts that. In that second image, we see individuals are given different support systems in order to allow them, the chance to see the game and to have equal access. And then the third one is if we remove all the systemic barriers that continue to be reproduced in our society, that's what equity would look like. So everyone, would have the support or accommodations that they need that would bring them up to speed with those in the dominant group that have been able to progress much faster than many others. So when we think about inclusion, and this is something I often see, so I come from an academic background, and I would see a lot of diversity on campus as a faculty member, but when I saw most people who look like me, they were the secretaries, the cleaning crew, and landscapers. So the university could say they were rather diverse, that's true. But when I looked at leadership, I often don't see that diversity. So inclusion is more than having a seat at the table. It's actually being heard and having your input considered in the decision-making process. So women were often told, we need to lean in or things of that nature. But reality is that when you have inclusion with a diverse group of people, you create innovation. We find that productivity rates increase. We find retention rates are higher. People don't want to leave organizations where they feel that sense of belonging. And so inclusion is, again, very important. So some of the emotional tolls, reality is we know now that we have a lot of civil unrest in our society, and it is surrounding this social construct of racism. And racism has a serious mental health toll on those who experience it. And as I shared, and it is, as Catherine said, I am a product of interracial marriage, and I grew up in a predominantly white space. So I wasn't necessarily exposed early on to the impact of racism, but once I left my parents' household, I was. And it creates a lot of emotional and mental health issues, to include PTSD. So we see racism creates this feeling of disconnect and loneliness, and this ideal of second guessing yourself and things and not knowing really how to interpret experiences that you've had. So I've had situations where I've walked in behind someone in a store and they have allowed the door to shut in my face. Well, as a person of color, I don't really know how to take that. So my first assumption is that person doesn't have any home training, like they don't have any manners. That's where I go to first. But then I'm also a woman. So then I'm like, if it's a man, I'm like, well, maybe he doesn't like women, maybe he's had, bad experience. And then usually my last thing is maybe it's because of the beautiful complexion of my skin. Maybe that's an issue. But it messes with your psyche in regards to, how you interpret things, to include your interactions with others. But it decreases hope in the future in regards to justice in the government. If we think about some of the recent things that we've seen with George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, now we have an issue in Ohio that we're unaware of with a gentleman named Casey who was shot. And we just, it just creates a lot of stress and uncertainty, and it impacts our mental health. It's a lot of trauma. It's worried. It creates this decreased trust in individuals. So what can you do kind of to educate yourself about the impacts, and when you interact with your clientele, is really to gain an understanding of the issues that some of your colleagues may continue to experience daily, or the clients that you are dealing with, not understanding or knowing what type of situation they're coming from, what experiences they've had. As per my understanding, you work with individuals who have been incarcerated. In the prison population, it is very segregated based on that social construct of race. We know that over 2 million people are incarcerated in America. Over 1 million of them are Black and brown, and over 56% of them are in there for nonviolent drug offenses. We also know that in the prison population, oftentimes it's in rural areas. So the prison guards will not be of the same ethnicity of those who are incarcerated, and they may not have interacted with people who look like those who are incarcerated, which creates a really large disconnect. But explicitly acknowledge, what is happening when you see these experiences taking place. When someone is talking with you about the toll that racism has taken on their mental health, or they're sharing a recent experience with you that they've had, just listen, try to be empathetic and allow them to tell their story. Ask those that you consider friends how you may be able to support them. And we're going to talk a little bit later about allyship and just how important that is. When we think even about the LGBTQI community, when we think about Islamophobia and a variety of other issues that we have. So there have been some studies that have been conducted when we think about racism and just the emotional toll. And it finds that the killing of unarmed African Americans by police negatively affect the mental health of African Americans, particularly in the states in which the killings happen. Again, as a biracial person who worked with law enforcement and means no disrespect at all to law enforcement, and has depended upon them when I was a probation officer, Reality is we know that most police are good people, that they go into it for the right reason. But we need to really look at training and interactions between communities. So that implicit bias training is so imperative. And I know that we have a training scheduled for later on where we'll go more in depth with that. But, but the trauma that is imposed on these communities, because myself, I can't watch another African American be shot. I mean, it continues to be shown in the media, and it's just very impactful in the emotional toll that it takes. And I have an 18-year-old son who drives, and so that creates a level of stress. For Caucasians, there were no negative health effects found among the appropriate 900,000 adults who responded to the survey. But if a person is armed, we see that it doesn't cause the same negative mental health effects to African Americans or Caucasians. So we see that reality is that African Americans are in line with if a person is armed and they're causing a threat, they understand and they see why they're being shot. But it's the unarmed situations that continue to negatively impact our community. So when there are not repercussions, like literally trials and convictions and incarceration, what that does is that displays to many in the African American community that their lives don't matter. If we think about the recent issue with Breonna Taylor, I mean, the police were charged with shooting into another apartment, but not for the killing of her. So these killings, are a public health crisis, and it's been recognized by scholars. And I'll have to say that in Milwaukee, my home, which is hyper segregated, that they've recognized racism as a public health crisis. So they're actually recognizing and understand, the continued impact it has on the community. So I had done this, and this was so not intentional. I'm very active on LinkedIn, and someone had shared an article about, ask any Black person, and they can tell you the first time that they were called a racial slur. So I posted and I shared my experience, and my experience was when I was 16 and I was in my community, but I was walking from work, which was at McDonald's, and someone yelled out of the window, 3 men. I remember the car, kind of what they looked like, and they called me the N-word and told me to go back to my side of town, which I was actually on my side of town. But, when I posted that, I got a lot of people who provided input. Someone said racial slur. The first of what would be many was in second grade at Girl Scout camp. My 2 camp counselors decided to name her Buckwheat for the duration of her stay. I was in the 3rd grade and her name was Amber. And she talked about, the N-word, and she was referring to another student who attended an after-school program. The person talked about being 12 and they were at school heading to the office where a girl bumped into him and called him a coon. And the reason I'm sharing this is because these things happen and people remember from the 2nd grade, the first incident that they had where they've been subjugated based on this whole social construct of race. But if you look, I had 87 comments, and it totally was not an intentional social experiment, but it ended up being one. So again, just that emotional toll. So I know that stop and frisk, thank goodness, has stopped taking place in New York, but I wanted to share the stats with you. So if you look at that and you look at the minorities who are stopped, right? Just the disproportionate rate and how many were innocent. Over 8,000 people were innocent, 13,000 were stopped. 59% were African American, 29% were Latinx. And it just continues to go. In 2008, 11,000 stopped, 70% African American, 70% innocent, 57% African American, 31% Latino. So, I mean, the disparity in the ideal of the criminality of the Black and brown body continues to impose a lot of trauma that needs to be addressed. And I think Yoga for Change, just teaching people how to meditate, relax, and kind of let go of some of those anxieties that come with being a person of color in America, it is very important. So my question is, do Black Lives Matter? Really? And I want to share with you some of the stats and why I asked that question. So I hear people say when someone says Black Lives Matter, they say all lives matter. And we understand that no one's saying that not all lives matter. What Black Lives Matter is saying that until the most subjugated in our community, their issues are addressed, all lives truly can't matter, right? Because if we have one group that continues to see certain disparities, then reality is all lives don't matter. But we know African American children are twice as likely to die during their first year of life than anyone in America. So the infant mortality rate for African American children is astronomical in America and is actually comparable to third world nations. African American, Native, and Alaskan Native women are 2 to 3 times more likely to die from pregnancy related causes than white women. They die during childbirth at a disproportionate rate as well. Suspension, expulsion rates. So I'll share with you in Duval County, they are the 20th largest school district, the 6th largest in Florida, and number 1 in the entire state of Florida for referring African American and Latino children to law enforcement for disciplinary reasons, as well as suspension and expulsions. I shared with you the incarceration rates. We have only 5% of the world's population, but we incarcerate 25% of the world's population. And out of that, like I shared, 2 million are men, and over 1 million of them are African American and Latino men, and over 56% of them are incarcerated for nonviolent drug offenses, as we sit in a state that has just legalized recently medicinal marijuana. Excuse me. If you think about the COVID-19, we see the disparity in the death rates there as well. We look at rates of pay. Think of women, right? Caucasian women make 77 cents on the dollar compared to men. African American women make 64 cents. Hispanic women make 57 cents. And Native women make 44 cents on the dollar. If we look at the unemployment rate, we know that the unemployment rate, if it's 7% in America overall, in minority communities, it's going to be double that. If we look at the Fortune 500 companies, only 4 of their CEOs are African American. 38 of the 500 are women, and 1 is a woman of color. So we continue to see these disparities. And we see this timeline of oppression. I know people say, well, I didn't own slaves. I don't know if my European side owned slaves or not. But the reality is that we're not that far, removed from segregation, from Jim Crow, from having to have a civil rights movement. And we see what I consider the continuum of the civil rights movement with the current civil unrest surrounding the construct of race in America. So if we look at rates of home ownership in the United States, we continue to see these disparities, right? African Americans at 42.1%, Hispanic 47.5%, Native or Alaskan Natives 50%, Asians 57%. But we see white non-Hispanics at 73%. And this is due oftentimes to past historical institutional policies, such as housing covenants and redlining. So as a veteran, if I came back from World War II, which I'm not that old, and I wanted to use my VA home loan, as a person of color, I would not have been able to because of redlining and housing covenants. And if you think about it, reality is that equity in our home is how oftentimes people pay for their children to go to college. And so not only are you locked out, when you look at home ownership historically, but it has generational impacts. If we think of the housing bust that happened in 2008, we see that minorities were the ones, everybody was impacted, but they were disproportionately impacted. And sociologists have done studies and found that even when minorities had the same credit score and income as those in the majority group, when they went to the bank for a loan, oftentimes they were given subprime loans or rates which caused lots of issues and why we saw them disproportionately impacted by the housing bust. So I just want you all to take a moment and think about this for your diversity profile activity. So if I were to do mine in my environment, I am 2 or more races, right? My coworkers are, and they go across the gamut. My supervisor is, and it goes across, right? My elementary school was predominantly Caucasian. My teachers were mostly Caucasian. Most of my close friends are variety. My dentist is actually an immigrant. My doctor is whoever's available at NAS Jax, people who regularly visit my home, again, run the gamut. My neighbors are, and I live in a very diverse neighborhood, so I truly appreciate that. But just to give you an ideal and opportunity to reflect, on who you're interacting with, because reality is that we're very comfortable with others who are very similar to us, which is natural. But we need to kind of step outside of our comfort zones if we're going to learn and grow and begin to engage with people who don't have the same religious belief or political beliefs or social economic status or educational level, because we need to learn how to be empathetic and interact with everyone, because believe me, you'll find that you have more similarities than you do differences. So I want to just go over some terminology with you that I think it's important, again, for us all to understand so we're on the same page when we have these conversations. So intersectionality is a concept that was created by legal scholars Kimberly Crenshaw, and it basically recognizes that some people occupy more than one marginalized identity, such as women of color, such as, say, a woman of color who identifies in the LGBTQI community. She's occupying 3 marginalized spaces. So it's just being a woman and belonging to a racial or ethnic minority group, such as African American, Hispanic, Asian. That's intersectionality, is because those are interdependent systems of disadvantage. So African American or Latino males who identify in the LGBTQI community, same thing, that intersectionality. Reverse racism, I've heard conversations surrounding that. And I really need people to understand that is really more an emotional response than a realistic one. It's against the law. You can't, hire someone who's not qualified over someone who is, for some ideal quota system. That's not a reality. That's a Title VII violation and something that should not take place anywhere. LGBTQI, I think you all know, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and intersex. Lesbian, we know, are women who tend to prefer, other women as their partners. Gay is often associated with males who prefer other males as their partners. Bisexual are people who prefer male and females as their intimate partner. Queer used to be used as a very derogatory word, and I love that the community has taken it back and empowered it. But it relates to being attracted to someone, it can be of the same sex, but it's often used as a positive descriptor by those in the community. We know intersex. I'm not sure if you all know this, but 2,000 children born have the anatomy of both the genitalia of both a male and a female. Too often what happens is that medical doctors make the decision early on to decide what gender that child should be. And oftentimes they make them female, as that's the easiest part, but they haven't allowed the child to grow up to figure out really how they identify. If you want to watch a really good TED Talk, one of my PhD cohort members, she's a professor at UNLV. Her name is Georgianne Davis, and her TED Talk is called "This Girl Has Balls," and she was born intersex, and she is intersex, but she was basically lied to, and she was not aware. The doctors made the decision early on, and when she was a teenager, she had testes that were in her stomach that were going to drop. And they lied to her medically and told her something else was going on so they could go in and remove those. But intersex is more common than people realize. And it's something, you know, that we all need to be aware of. Pronouns. So as you see, I have mine up there, she, her, hers, and that's associated with the LGBTQI community. And I do that in my signature blocking on everything, because my point is that I want people to know that I'm an ally, you know, that however you identify doesn't is used to describe someone whose gender identity is not exclusively male or female. Gender, I know I froze for a moment. So gender is a social construct, just like race. Of pink, you know, and I love that Target has changed kind of their settings, and so they don't have male or female toys. They just have one you know, section of toys. Can you all hear me? Yes.
Yeah, you came in and out for a second, but you're back.
Yes, and if I just might add, guys, because I've had this problem with my company, if everybody stops their video so that it's not consuming bandwidth, that will probably help Dr. Tammy have a little bit better of you know, memory and bandwidth on her end to be able to do that. So if you just
All right, thank you. Thank you. I didn't know that. I'd be using that myself. Thank you so much. So yeah, gender, again, is just a social construct. It just like race, right? It was developed as an ideal of what each sex, which is biological, should wear and what characteristics should be displayed, right? So again, pink is often associated with girls. And then when we think oftentimes of gender, people want to place women in these boxes, you know, well, they should be nurses, not doctors. They should be secretaries versus the CEO. But sex is actually biological. And that's, excuse me, what genitalia a person was born with, whether they have a penis or a vagina. But we did talk about intersex and how different that is. Cisgender is someone who identifies with the sex that they were biologically born. So like myself, I'm cisgendered. I identify as a female. My sex is a female. Heterosexual obviously is someone who's sexually attracted to someone of the opposite sex. We're pretty used to that. And as I explained earlier, race is just a social construct and it's not biologically real. There are no chromosomes or genes that differentiate African Americans from European Americans. If you think about blood donation or organ donation, we know that really what matters is the blood type, you know, whether it's a match or not, but the whole construct of race does not matter. And like I told you, it is an American ideal and it's been used to justify statuses and stratification, but it's something that really needs to be done away with. Racial formation is that historical process by which racial categories were created and inhabited and transformed and destroyed. So if we think about Eastern Europeans, I'm not sure how many of you all are aware, but the Irish, Polish, and Italian, initially when they came to the United States as immigrants, they were not perceived to be white and they were treated as less than, and they were treated poorly. Now, when people talk about ethnicity, oftentimes they don't share their ethnicity, they talk in terms of race, but we're all actually ethnic. And that's something that I would hope that we could kind of take this whole racial narrative and take that away and focus more on we're Americans or I'm African American, my mother is German American, you know, things of that nature. And racism is a doctrine of racial supremacy that sees one race as superior to another, where again, that's not at all true. So ethnicity is what we all are. We're all ethnic, and that's based on our national origins, customs, and cultures, right? So we have our ethnic beings with roots either in Africa, Europe, the Middle East, Asia. And this phrase is one of the newer ones that's in the DEI space is the BIPOC, which is Black, Indigenous, and People of Color. Institutional racism is recognizing that really when all the institutions in America were created, it was very much about cisgender property owning European men in positions of authority. So that the institutions that were created were really not geared towards women, towards people of color, really even towards those in the lower socioeconomic status. So xenophobia is a dislike or prejudice against people from other countries. And we have to remember that America, we're a country of immigrants, so we should not display any type of disdain for someone who is new to our country. If anything, we should be welcoming and want to actually learn about other cultures. At least that's what I like to do. Islamophobia is a range of negative feelings towards Muslims and their region. And I think we all saw a lot of that after 9/11, but I want to share with you that the largest group of Muslims in America are actually African American, and they belong to the Nation of Islam. But those are not the ones who are often profiled by people because of what happened in 9/11. And that was just a small group of individuals. And that's just that overgeneralization when we group everybody together. And that's what created that Islamophobic behavior we saw. Everyone to be is a verb, right? It's an ongoing process of learning about the experiences of oppressed groups and supporting them. So I want you all to be allies. And some things that you can think about when you think about allyship is, remember, it's a verb, it's not a title. It's an ongoing process. It's about learning and educating, like what we're doing tonight, right? And it's also about taking actions to support others. So when you see something, say something. I know we say that like OPSEC a lot in the military. When you see something, say something, but if you see a situation where someone is being treated poorly and it's based solely on whatever category they belong to, whether it be a woman, whether it be someone in the LGBTQI community, whether it be an immigrant, whether it be a Muslim, whether it be a person of color, if that person who is imposing, the negativity on that individual is someone that take that time, don't embarrass them, don't call them out right then, but make sure that you remember that conversation and that you do pull them aside and have and have dialogue with them. And ask them, do they realize, what they did? How do they think that person felt when they experienced whatever it was that they said or they did to them and the action that they took? But you have to expect to be uncomfortable, and it's okay. We all need to be comfortable having these uncomfortable conversations, because this is why this continues to be reproduced in our society, is that we have not had these much needed conversations. So subjects like race and inequality, they're not considered polite. So oftentimes it seems awkward to engage in these topics at first, but it's a sign of growth. And believe me, it gets easier with time. And if you make a mistake and you're with not in a bad way, but in a way that's just very transparent and caring. When I was at the law school, I had a student that was transitioning. And initially when I came to the law school, she was a female. And through the transition period, he became Ben. And I had made mistakes throughout, because initially when I met Ben, Ben was not Ben. And he was okay with that. And every time I made a mistake, I caught it in regards to the pronouns and how to address them, and I corrected it. And he was never upset about it. He knew it was an accident. It was not intentional. There was no malice, so just be okay being uncomfortable. But don't take anything personal. As many of us are still learning how to be better allies during a time when emotions are high, it's important to focus on the people who are impacted and the changes that they are seeking, rather than how we, as would be allies, are feeling. So again, just get comfortable being uncomfortable. Understand that when someone, shares with you an experience that they've had that's been negative surrounding some variable, such as their sexual identity or their ethnicity, just listen. You don't necessarily have to have a response. It's just being empathetic and being someone they're willing to listen. But try not to take over the conversation and allow them to share with you. So make space for that imperfection. Again, like I shared with you with Ben, I made mistakes. And I corrected them every time I did, and I just knew, and he knew it was not from my heart. It was not something that was done intentional, because it's easy to criticize others when you believe you're right instead of pointing critiques on others. Why don't you focus that energy to work on yourself? So I'm constantly reading, I'm watching videos, I'm constantly trying to improve on myself, what I know, how I interact with people, and make sure that I'm approachable. So activate a growth mindset. We're all in this together. Everybody's starting their diversity, equity, and inclusion journey, though at a different point. So we need to recognize that, but just activate that growth mindset. Be ready to be transparent, be ready to receive feedback, and be accepting of that. So I want to share some information with you about some, the not-for-profit space in regards to people of color. So some questions, there was a study done on the experiences of people of color in the not-for-profit space. And some of the questions asked dealt with how race plays into the context of fundraising. And the study actually found that oftentimes people of color struggle in the fundraising space because they haven't typically been in that space. And it's predominantly dominated by Caucasian or European Americans. So some realities are, it's difficult to establish a career in fundraising because, again, that means entering a predominantly white space. So if you're in a fundraising space as a European American, and take them along the ride with you, introduce them to others in the room that how certain processes work within that space or, within that group. Because when people of color are viewed consciously or subconsciously as outsiders, it's often harder for them to bring in those resources, right? And we want to create space where everyone can be comfortable and they can bring their authentic selves into that space. And at that table, into the workplace, into whatever organization they're in. And so for people of color to be successful in the not-for-profit sector, they must have executive leadership support regarding their professional development. So with this research, it was done in Denver, and one point of the study was to assist the not-for-profits in providing them assistance in creating these inclusive practices. So what you guys are doing now, like how you're having this training, and your CEO, the founder of the organization is the one who came and asked for this training, shows you the commitment that is being made within the organization to dismantle some of the systemic issues that continue to impact marginalized communities. But we have to understand that structural racism is very real. And it impacts people's ability to kind of be successful at their job in society, in our society really as a whole. So white development staffers and allies, you must be an active part of the solution besides simply not being part of the problem. So really that allyship is so important. We're calling upon all our allies to assist us, to move us all forward. If you think of the civil rights movement, I mean, we saw the allies who came out of European descent who were not okay with the continued subjugation and segregation of minorities, and they came out and they let their voices be heard. And then we saw the 19th place, and I think we're seeing that now in the current movement. We see allies out marching, calling for change, requesting that body cam footage be released, that communities be invested in, that we have systems in place to address the continued inequality that we see due to systemic issues. So often not-for-profit works to help marginalized communities, but often they don't have a lot of people who belong to those communities on their boards, and you want to have that representation on your board because they're going to bring a different perspective from their lived experiences that may be advantageous to your organization. And we see often this kind of self-reinforcing cycle, which causes a white majority staff, right? And this is not just a not-for-profit. We'll see, you know, with majority white staff, oftentimes that recruitment is via staff networks. So it's people telling other people, you know, we have a job available, and they're sharing. Oftentimes, if you think about that diversity profile sheet we went through, tend to look like them, have the same religion, come from the same background, you know, whether it be geographically, educational, sexual orientation. But we see, you know, 75% of white Americans have social networks without any minority representation. And when I mean minority, I mean those in the LGBTQI community. I'm talking different religions to, you know, Muslims, Hindi, a variety of things. But we also see that implicit bias elevates white applicants. And one of the trainings that we go over when we do the implicit bias, we'll talk specifically about how that kind of functions. But in a controlled study of job openings across industries, they found that applicants with white sounding names are 50% more likely to get an interview than African Americans or people of color with African American sounding names, or those who are from different countries who have ethnic sounding names as well. And studies have shown, I saw one recently where this gentleman, his name was Jose, I think his last name was Ortiz, and he sent out over 200 resumes and he never got a call back. And he changed his name to Joe and then some common last name and applied to those exact same jobs and began to get interviews. You know, so we see, you know, as sociologists, when we do these studies, we see that it continues to be reinforced because we're not interacting with people outside of our circle. Interview bias is often
Tammy, I think we lost you. Oh, there we go.
Oh, how this is new. This is a new thing. Dr. Hodo, are you still here?
Yeah, I think we just
Yeah, I think we lost her.
lost.
Okay.
The presentation's gone too, so.
Yeah. So I'm learning a lot. I don't know about you guys. I'm
Yeah.
learning quite a bit.
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, I was actually going to type in, just wait till she gets back on, into the type box that we do have some positions opening up for our organization, as many of you know, and we are actively attempting to work with an outside contractor specifically so that we don't keep doing that, the same kind of names getting to the top for interviews too. So I just thought that was a really interesting awareness I wanted to bring to your all's attention, that we are aware of that, and that's why we're kind of working with an outside firm. So is there any questions thus far? Anybody have anything that they want to share just until Dr. Hodo comes back on?
I just wanted to say, I don't know if anybody else has been through the REI training, but I went to REI groundwater, and they give like a lot of depth to some of the statistics she pulls from about like the studies around names and the, you know, medical stuff and all of that. Like they balance it. So just if you get an opportunity, it's a good one.
okay. I'm sorry, you all.
No worries.
I was like, what happened?
No big deal. No big deal.
Okay, let's go back. Oh, sorry.
Gotcha.
There we go. Let me switch it out to There we go. Okay, I am so sorry. I tell you, the internet sometimes is not technology, sometimes is not our friend, right?
No worries.
So
We're flexible.
so that's thank you. Thank you so much. So that self-reinforcing cycle, right? We talked a little bit about that. So what are some best practices for not-for-profits to establish that inclusivity, which is what I know you all are working on? Your CEO of a profit always establishes the level of commitment, the attitude, the pace, and the behaviors related to the overall inclusive practice because the tone is being set, right? So having a CEO of color doesn't guarantee a commitment to developing an inclusive organization. Through the race or ethnicity of an organization's CEO may not affect the inclusivity level. It's still a factor. But again, your CEO is the one that sets the tone, right, for your organization. And I think a great tone is being set. So I know that oftentimes people like really do not want to hear, oh, I don't have privilege as a Caucasian or European American because I come from a low income family. Reality is I understand that. But white privilege doesn't mean that your life hasn't been hard. It just means that your skin tone isn't one of the things making it harder, right? So I don't come from necessarily a low income background, but there are certain assumptions that are attached to me when I walk into spaces. People make assumptions about me because I am African American presenting, so I must come from a low income household. Maybe I grew up in the projects. My parents weren't married, just very derogatory things, but those are never associated with European Americans. And so that's the whole point about the privilege, right? It's not to say that your life has not been rough. It's not to say that, there are not Caucasian people who are incarcerated, who are living in poverty, who are struggling with domestic violence, emotional issues, all these other things. What it means is that, because of the color of your skin, it's not, impacting your life. It's not making it harder, right? So the American ideal of bootstrapping, we need to remember it's okay to encourage others to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. But what we have to remember is that some people have no boots. And this is due to historical policies and practices that have impeded certain groups from, advancing as far as they could. I think of the LGBTQI community, and I think of the movements that are going on. And I don't know if you all are aware, but just recently, sexual identity and transgender has been added, which is great, under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act for a reason that you cannot discriminate against someone. So we are seeing progress. And just, I want to say this week or the end of last week, the Supreme Court decided that they're not going to hear a case in regards to transgender and the whole bathroom issue. They're saying that people should be able to use the restroom of how they identify versus the biological sex that they were born. So there is some progress being made, and we need to continue that fight as well. So some of the things you can do within this realm is recognize your privilege, get comfortable about your experiences. And when someone tells you or shares a story with you, it is never, ever about guilt. That is not it, because I often hear people say, well, I didn't own slaves, or, my ancestors, this and that. Reality is most white people didn't own slaves. It was only 25% that could afford to own slaves because it was those in the higher social economic status group. And the rest were poor, right? But 90% of African Americans can trace their history back to slavery. So it's not about guilt. It's just about acknowledging that people have different experiences. And a lot of it does have to do with that whole social construct of race. It has to do with, sexual identity. It has to do with biological sex, things of that nature. But don't take over those conversations and don't make assumptions. I really ask that you advocate for the voiceless and understand that cognitive dissonance is very real surrounding issues of oppression. And when I say cognitive dissonance, is that oftentimes what people have been told and taught their entire lives, it's not real. You know, it's not true. I'll share with you, my mom was brought up to be very racist, not just against African Americans or Hispanics, but to include Polish, Irish, and Italians. She was brought up with the ideology, and her parents instilled that in her. So she said when she went to the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee at 17, and she's in this big stadium room, and you know, every seat is basically taken, and she has a seat next to her, and she put her purse there. She said an African-American student had come into the classroom and was running late. And my mom said she moved her purse and allowed the African.
Oh no, I'm like, what happened? What happened with the
Yeah.
African-American student?
I
Dr. Hodo,
know.
I gotta know.
Yes,
No.
tell me.
Tell me,
You
Dr.
know?
Hodo. Oh no.
We need the rest of the story.
I know. Oh man. Susie, can you make me the host, Susie?
Yeah.
Such a
Sorry,
cliffhanger.
guys.
Oh my
there you go.
gosh.
Dr. Hodo, we're all like, what happened to the African-American student? Please tell us.
I know, right?
Yeah, okay, so okay, back to that. There we go.
Okay. So my mom actually allowed her to sit next to her. She was doing her a favor by doing that. So yeah, and that's what I'm saying. I mean, she did. She thought because she was brought up that way, you know, that she thought, oh, she was doing her a really big favor by allowing her to sit next to her. And like I said, obviously that changed, because if not, I wouldn't be here, right? So, I really want you all to think about, you know, ways to become an ally and things that you could read. And if you like, I actually have a list of books I'd be more than happy to share with you all that can help you along that journey. So like difficult dialogue, when we have it, we need to understand our identity. And so I understand when I'm talking with someone in the LGBTQI community that I'm a heterosexual. I don't know the struggles, you know, that often go along with that identity. So I have to understand, you know, my own identity as a heterosexual, you know, and and recognize my biases, which reality is we all have. You all will take the implicit association test, and we're going to talk about those biases. But as humans, every human has biases, and we have to recognize and understand those. But we have to validate the feelings of those who share their experiences with us and encourage that difficult dialogue. But we need to be attentive. You know, when they're sharing with us, be an active listener, you know, and just listen and allow them to express themselves. And acknowledge when you don't know or understand something. It's okay. You know, I'll tell people I don't understand, or what do you mean? And I hadn't heard of that. I need to look that up, because I'm always trying to understand and learn more. So this is one of my favorite quotes, and this is really true. I've learned that people will forget what you say and people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. And I think that's really important for all of us to remember as we interact with people who often have been traumatized, whether it be due to PTSD, being in the military and serving in the war, or if they've been incarcerated, or children who are coming from, you know, families that are not functioning the way that we think they should be. We just have to remember that the way we make people feel, if we make them feel important and valued and that we care for them, that feeling will last and you'll create a friend. So in the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. And again, that's another one of my favorite quotes, because it's true. I always think of the poem that goes a little bit like, when they came for the gypsies, I didn't say anything because I wasn't one. When they came for the Jews, I didn't say anything because I wasn't one. And when they came for me, there was no one left to say anything. And so I think that we need to be cognizant of that, and recognize, you know, how impactful we can be in others' lives, and just, you know, make sure that we're attentive and that we're understanding and that we're here to learn and not shut people down. So here are my references. And really that was the end of my presentation, but I would love to have dialogue. Did anybody have any questions?
Yes, we had a couple individuals request your book list that you said if you wanted to
Okay.
share books. I don't know if you wanted to, if you
Yep.
wanted to just email it to us, that would be great. And we can
Yeah,
distribute.
I'll email that with this. Yep, I'll email that with the survey.
Okay, great.
Mhm.
And then we have a question from Shiva. Dr. Hoda, could you expand on cognitive dissonance and how to address it when people live in an echo chamber?
Oh yeah, it's
Yeah.
difficult. So what I like to do is, I mean, because I'll share with you some of the experiences I've had. Now, I have a PhD, right? And I've been in academia, and I would teach classes on race and ethnicity in general, like intro to sociology classes, right? And I would always have a student who would question or challenge me when we began to talk about race. And I'm like, and it's just, it was very difficult for them. And I'm thinking, gosh, here I am with a PhD teaching a 100 level class. And and I don't mind the questions, but it was kind of like they just didn't believe what I was saying. So what I found useful is that I would give them resources from people who look like them. You know what I'm saying? That were basically stating the same thing. So a really good book I like is White Fragility, and that is written by a white academic. Another person I really love is Jane Elliott when it comes to race. She's phenomenal. She's the one who did the blue eye, brown eyes. If you guys have ever seen that experiment with the students, and they were all Caucasian. And she gave them, so she did your blue eyes, your brown eyes, and she basically ranked them as if they were races. And she was able to do that, and automatically a lot of the students did not like that experiment because they felt that subjugation and stratification. So you should really look her up. She's alive, and I hope well. And she does, and she has just a lot of videos out there. Oprah has talked with her, and she is phenomenal. And I'm looking at the chats now. So let me see. Oh, you guys, yes to the books. I'll do that. You've taken the implicit bias test is shocking, isn't it? So when I took it, even the one based on race, I tend to favor European Americans more than African Americans. When I took it based on sexual identity, I favor heterosexuals more than those in the LGBTQI community. So it was very disappointing to me. So when you do take it, just read. That's why I'm sharing mine with you. I was very disappointed, but it's the reality and it's unconscious. Yeah, and books for kids. Yes.
I have a question for you. Hi, I'm Simone. I'm on the board. So I'm not part of the yoga teaching community at Yoga for Change, but I am a yoga teacher as well. So, and your speech tonight, your presentation tonight was very powerful. So, I mean, I love it when a person comes to a dialogue with just statistics and facts. It's just it resonates on so many different levels. And I'm curious if you've seen the Chelsea Handler White Privilege series that she did. And if so, what was your reaction to that? And what did you think about that?
I thought it was great. I love that she said she didn't recognize, that privilege that she had. And she held herself to the carpet, and she said, I didn't realize, that it was that so much more difficult for minority comedians, and so I appreciate that because it's like, I think you have to do that kind of soul searching in order to understand, some of the privileges that are attributed, even like heterosexuals, right? I mean, I don't have to worry about the restroom, in that regard. I know no one's going to question me, but I think about my trans friends who are being harassed, and things like, and it's just like, are you serious? Because I know statistically pedophiles are more likely to be heterosexual males, so giving them stats to me is always helpful. So yeah, I thought she did a really good job.
It was a very powerful presentation that you did. So kudos to you. Lovely.
Thank you. And I see someone asked, do I have some book recommendations for teens? Yeah, I do. very diverse course, very diverse class this year, which is awesome. But yeah, and it's one book. It's called "Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together?" And it's very, very good. And that's one that the kids can read. But it's some of the ones on my books, especially for high school, I think they're ready for it. And these kids, this generation gives me hope. Because when I look at them, even my son, like he graduated from Episcopal High School and he's a freshman at Florida State. Episcopal was not diverse at all. But he was able to find his friend group. He didn't experience, any microaggressions or things of that nature. And he was on crew, and he was one of 2 African Americans out of 76 kids. And again, his experiences were very different than what I've experienced. So.
I was thinking of. Yeah, I was just thinking about the comment about the names, because the other day my son asked me why all of the Chinese kids in his class changed their names to like typical American names, and I said, well, it's probably because they're easier for other people to learn or pronounce, and he was like, they're not. Their real names aren't hard to pronounce. I don't understand it. And but maybe it's related to what you were saying with the names. I hadn't thought about it at the time, but
well, that one too, Amy. And also, so one of my biggest pet peeves is I've seen Americans will rename someone. I mean, we'll rename someone, from China or somewhere else instead of taking the time to actually learn how to pronounce the name.
right.
And it's just like, it's just like, why don't we just learn how? And I've done that where I'll just write it down phonetically. So then I know, because I want to know your real name. And I want to call you by the name that your parents gave you, not some other name,
Yeah. And, just one other thought that kind of occurs to me. It's interesting to me, I think more recently I've just done more kind of self-examination about these topics. But, it's interesting to me, my reaction to different people, I think based on my experiences, is not as much related to race as much as body language or the way people are dressed. I've noticed, for example, I have a strong reaction to like people that appear like frat boys or something like that, because of experiences I've had in my life. Or I don't know. It's a whole other kind of aspect of that piece of how we react to people we're around. And I don't know, I think having these trainings is really good because you get kind of words to express some of these things that we do that we don't realize that we do. And that frat boy looking guy may not be a bad person, but I react that way to them because of experiences in my life. I don't know. It's just good to examine, I think, all these different ways we respond to people around us that may be different than, what our expectations are or what we want to see.
Yeah, I mean, think about this. So what's the stereotype of the basic white chick? And there is a stereotype, right? She's got on yoga pants, she's got on Uggs, she's waiting for the pumpkin spice latte. I mean, you know what I'm saying? Right? I mean,
yeah.
And that's just overgeneralized, right? Stereotypes that people have. But we see it all the time. And then you automatically have this thought, oh, she's probably from a higher social economic status group, probably went to Brown or Cornell, and we have to kind of check ourselves really quick because that may not at all be the case, with this person, but it's that oversimplified generalization we make.
Right.
I want to acknowledge that we're after 6:30. Just mostly for Dr. Hoda's time and also for the team. So if you need to sign off, please do so. But if there's any other final questions, we are lucky to be funded by Lululemon and have more of these trainings coming in January and February. To be honest, I'm really excited for, I've taken 2 pages of notes on stuff that I thought I knew, but became more clear. So thank you again, Dr. Hoda, for this opportunity. Are there any other final questions or asks before we?
Hey, Catherine, I was just wondering if Dr. Hoda was going to be able to share the PowerPoint with us and send that to us, or if that was.
Yeah, I can.
Okay, that'd be
Yeah,
great.
I can. Yeah, I'll share that with you all. And I'm also gonna send Susie a survey, and then I'll also send the book list.
Great, wow. We're
And
so
then-
lucky.
This is, as everybody knows, this is being recorded. So we're making it available to everyone, even if, meaning you'll have access to the recording, even if you attended today, not just if you were one of the people that